Buck Sexton says the Epstein case still does not add up. The government says it is over. But the biggest questions never went away. In this video, we break down the unsettling details.
The Epstein stuff that just dropped.
Sure.
Director of CIA, going to his townhome to have meetings. What would they be meeting about?
The Epstein story across the board is one where the conspiracy theorists, so to speak, keep on looking like the ones that see what's really going on, meaning that it just gets, you have to believe more and more coincidences. You have to believe more and more of the official line, even though that doesn't really seem credible.
But the Epstein story did not begin in a jail cell in 2019. By then, he had already spent decades building wealth, access, and relationships at the highest levels of business, politics, and celebrity. For those who don't know, the official government line is that Jeffrey Epstein died by suicide in his jail cell on August 10, 2019, while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges. Authorities said there was no evidence of homicide, and later investigations pointed instead to major failures inside the jail, including missed checks, broken procedures, and staff negligence that allowed it to happen. Buck Sexton is not convinced of the government story, and on his own podcast, he still points to failures by the current administration.
So is the Epstein case closed? The DOJ says yes. A lot of people say, sorry, that's not going to cut it. There's still more that there has to be answered for. Saying you're transparent is not the same thing as being transparent. The memo and the management of expectations has been a mess. Okay.
Epstein's rise started long before the scandal became public. In the mid-1970s, he was teaching at the Dalton School in Manhattan, a school filled with the children of New York's elite. From there, he moved into Wall Street, and over time, he reinvented himself as a money man for the rich and powerful. There are still many unanswered questions surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. One of the biggest is how he managed to gain leverage over so many powerful people.
How did he manage to ingratiate himself with all these individuals? And how is it that nobody stopped to think? We don't know. First of all, some of them were hanging out with him after he was already a sex criminal.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, these are people for whom protecting their reputations generally is one of their most important considerations, right? You're a politician, you're a public figure, you're going to hang out with a known sexual predator? You're just going to hang out with some guy who's in some $80 million mansion in Manhattan and owns a private island off the U.S. Virgin Islands and owns a mansion in Palm Beach. You're going to hang out with him. Why? What is he going to do for you? How did he get them? I mean, Bill Gates spent a lot of time with him. Those people, a lot of them, were in the Epstein orbit. I've never heard a good explanation for how that all came together.
One of the most important turning points came when Leslie Wexner, the billionaire behind Victoria's Secret, hired Epstein as his personal money manager in the 1980s. That relationship gave Epstein money, legitimacy, and access to one of the most exclusive circles in America. Years later, Clay Travis outlined a theory on how that access may have helped Epstein pull powerful people into his orbit during a podcast with Buck Sexton. Here is how he explained it.
This guy, Epstein, was able to somehow get into a relationship with the owner of Victoria's Secret, was then able to get super hot girls that are Victoria's Secret models at all these events that he would then start to create. And as a result, he was able to get extremely rich and powerful men access to those women, and he took advantage of it. And intelligence agencies found out that he had this connection to the honeypot scheme, and they started to leverage what he was doing as well.
Being the person who throws the best parties can put you in the same rooms as powerful people. After that, the question becomes whether you have the money to stay in that world.
But we still don't know where the money came from, which is not that hard. You know what I mean? Forensic accounting. FBI is great at that. Where did the money come from? This guy's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You know what the first thing when this came out? People said, oh, he was a stock market trader. No hedge fund guys. I said, anyone ever heard of this guy? No. You're not making $600 million, $800 million on Wall Street. No one's ever heard of you before. This is crazy, right? Didn't make his money that way. So they don't really know where his money came from, which is a huge red flag in and of itself.
On paper, Epstein was presented as a financier with an estate worth about $577.6 million, and the public record showed a fortune built around an enormous collection of assets. His will and later reporting described tens of millions in cash, properties in New York, Florida, Paris, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, along with aircraft, boats, vehicles, art, and collectibles. After his death, those holdings became central to years of legal battles, including a Virgin Islands settlement that required more than $105 million in cash and half the proceeds from the sale of Little St. James, one of the islands he owned. Because Epstein's wealth was so opaque, many people saw that as a red flag and speculated it could point to powerful patrons, blackmail, or the kind of covert financial backing people sometimes associate with government assets.
And then there's well, what was he doing? He's running, we believe, right, a surveillance and blackmail operation, which likely involved, as from everything we can see, putting very powerful, very wealthy men in situations where they were engaged in sexual activity with, that is what the general belief is about what he was doing. How is it that we are sitting here now after he committed suicide in the prison where no one had ever been able to commit suicide before?
Yes, that is largely true. Epstein died at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, a facility that reportedly had not seen a reported suicide in 21 years before his death. He died before the case could reach trial, which made his death especially consequential. The central figure in the case was gone before cross-examination and before the public ever got a full courtroom account of how his operation worked and who may have been exposed by it.
After Ghislaine Maxwell has also gone off to prison, and we learned nothing from her trial, Sean. Nothing. Not a single person that I can think of, have we been told, is the actual target of this blackmail, with the exception of that British royal guy and, whatever, Prince Andrew.
Ghislaine Maxwell's trial began in Manhattan in late 2021, with prosecutors arguing that she was not a bystander in Epstein's world, but a central figure who helped recruit, groom, and exploit underage girls for years. At trial, multiple women testified that Maxwell built trust, normalized the abuse, and helped facilitate access to Epstein. On December 29, 2021, the jury found her guilty on 5 of 6 counts, and in June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her conviction was later upheld by the Second Circuit in September 2024, and the Supreme Court declined to hear her appeal on October 6, 2025. Maxwell's conviction established that the abuse network was real, but it still did not answer the larger question hanging over the whole case: how a man with Epstein's background managed to build such extraordinary access, protection, and staying power for so long.
Point being, how do you have a massive at least multi-year, maybe multi-decade blackmail operation with no targets? No one ever has this answer for me. How do you have a blackmail operation where nobody was being blackmailed? One where you made hundreds of millions of dollars? And I think the answer is, there are people who have been able to adjust the system to their liking in a way that certain facts have not come to light. I think we can all agree, we don't really know where his money came from, and it's massive wealth, hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay. We should know where all this money came and went. It's all being done electronically. It should all be trackable. Oh, Swiss banking, there's no such thing as Swiss banking secrecy anymore. Give me a break. There'd be ways to figure this out. Someone doesn't want to know.
Swiss bank accounts became famous because secrecy laws and offshore distance once made them useful for concealing assets, obscuring beneficial ownership, and making tax or asset tracing harder. But that secrecy is not untouchable anymore. Switzerland has participated in automatic financial account information exchange since 2017. The OECD says these rules were built to help end bank secrecy for tax purposes, and courts or prosecutors can still pursue bank records through international legal request systems if they aggressively follow the paper trail.
Then, if you go back to the earliest phase of the Epstein saga, he was given a plea deal. I remember I asked my friend Andy McCarthy, who was a Southern District of New York prosecutor. You probably see him on Fox. I asked him about this specifically, this notion. And so he confirmed it for me. They gave Epstein a plea deal that excused his underage sex trafficking beyond a 6-month basically home confinement. Like, I mean, it was a joke. It was like no sentence at all. And this was federal. But they also gave him that the plea deal covered him and unnamed possible co-conspirators.
The next major chapter began in Florida. By 2007, federal prosecutors had assembled a far more serious case, including a draft 60-count indictment. But instead of moving forward with that case, the government shifted toward the deal that would define the next phase of the Epstein story. Plea deals are common in American criminal law. Normally, a defendant agrees to plead guilty, prosecutors reduce or drop some charges or recommend leniency, and the judge still has the final say on sentencing. But Epstein's deal was not a normal plea bargain, so much as an unusually sweeping non-prosecution agreement. Federal prosecutors agreed not to charge him in South Florida if he pleaded guilty in state court, and the deal also extended protection to 4 named co-conspirators, plus any other potential co-conspirators. Everyone knew this was a crazy deal that would never happen under normal circumstances.
Alex Acosta, the former U.S. attorney who negotiated a controversial 2008 plea deal with Epstein, appeared before the House Oversight Committee on Friday. A Miami Herald investigation in 2018 described that non-prosecution agreement as the, quote, deal of a lifetime.
Later court findings said the victims were not told about that federal agreement before it was signed. That deal changed everything. It did not end the story. It delayed it. Epstein served an unusually lenient sentence, re-entered elite society, and the core questions about his money, his network, and his protection were never fully resolved.
I asked Andy, I said, Andy, you were in the Southern District of New York for like 23 years. Have you ever even heard of that before? A plea deal that gives immunity beyond the individual to unnamed individuals? He says, no, he told me, he says, that's not a thing. So you got a guy who is trafficking sexually underage girls. You got him nailed, dead to rights. And you give him the biggest sweetheart deal as a prosecutor anybody could ever imagine, the point where it's not even done in prosecutorial circles. Like, this isn't even attacked. Why would you ever do that? There's no basis for this in law. And remember, there was the federal prosecutor in Florida at the time. This came up during the Trump administration. He had to go because people were really upset about this when they figured out how the Epstein thing was initially, because there was all this focus on the Epstein trial.
He is talking about Alexander Acosta, the federal prosecutor in Florida tied to Epstein's 2007-2008 deal, who later resigned from his position as labor secretary during the Trump administration after the case came back into public focus.
They said, wait, what happened back in, the early mid-2000s when this first came up? So there's no explanation of that whatsoever, other than, and you've heard, I'm sure, the quote, we think he belongs to intelligence, and there are very powerful forces trying to stop us from knowing this. Sean, when the FBI actually did a raid on his home, and this was in the FBI, in the logs. I mean, you can actually check this one. They did a raid on his home, and they came upon tapes. They came upon what we assume would be surveillance footage. Now, we know he had the whole house mic'd up, camered up, the whole thing, including the rooms that were specifically meant for illicit activity. The FBI agent running the scene reached out to Epstein's lawyers and let Epstein lawyers come and decide what was privileged and what was able to be taken.
What makes this chapter so disturbing is that before law enforcement searched Epstein's Palm Beach house in 2005, later released documents suggest a private investigator working for his defense had already removed a large cache of material from the property, including computers, phone directories, and sexually explicit evidence. One of those missing computers was reportedly believed to be tied to the home's surveillance system, which is why this part of the story still raises so many questions about what investigators may never have fully seen.
I've never heard an explanation of this that didn't involve, I don't know, that's really bad. So what does that tell you? I hate when people just say this goes all the way to the top. The Epstein thing goes really high. I don't know where it stops, but this is not the way the system tells us that it works. And you're being asked to believe a lot when you're asked to believe the official narrative of what's really happened there.
He's just involved with so many people. I mean, the Virgin Islands are subpoenaing Larry Page of Google and JP Morgan for their ties with Epstein and human trafficking as of May 4, 2023.
Even after Epstein's death, the fallout kept spreading through banks, estates, and civil litigation. But time and again, the public pattern looked the same. Explosive allegations, partial disclosures, settlements, and a sense that the full architecture of the story was still just out of reach. The subpoena headlines sounded major, but the public outcome was much smaller. J.P. Morgan settled without admitting wrongdoing, and the Larry Page subpoena does not appear to have led to a separate public case.
This is where I go into I would love to believe that the system
We'll do the right thing.
wants justice and will do the right. Yeah, except see, this is what you want to believe. It's this party that wants to think the good guys, the cavalry, is going to arrive. Cavalry didn't arrive in time for all those young girls. Cavalry didn't show up to deal with that, piece of trash when it would have really counted and done something. And I think it's very hard for people to see all these moments where there was at best this failure and not feel like there's something else that is at work with all of it.
And that is really the core of the Epstein story. For many people, it is not just one suspicious detail, but the accumulation of them. There are too many convenient failures and too little transparency for the public to fully accept the government's story.
I think that there's no good explanations for how these things happen that don't involve. There is such a thing as a conspiracy, and some conspiracies are real. I mean, there are few things that, no matter how powerful and rich you are, will destroy you, in the public eye and legally, as fast as illegal acts with underage girls. So what are the very powerful people who Epstein was targeting? What are they not willing to do? Or what levers are they not willing to pull in order to make this sort of thing go away?
Nothing. They're having sex with underage women. That doesn't get any worse than that.
Jeffrey Epstein was trafficking underage girls, and the system gave him a 6-month, home confinement and just, made most of it go away. And then he kept doing it. That's the system.
At the center of the Epstein story is not just one mystery, but a pattern. Unexplained wealth, extraordinary access, a sweetheart plea deal, missing transparency, and a system that repeatedly seemed to fail when it mattered most. How does this sit with you? Comment down below. If you are new here, this is Classified Context, where we break down complex, controversial, and often misunderstood stories into clear, structured narratives to help you understand all the nuances and background. Subscribe for more.